China's economic growth over the past 4 decades stands as one of the most remarkable development stories in modern history. Largely fueled by strong industrial output, massive infrastructure investments, and a relentless drive to become a global manufacturing hub, the country's economic ascent reshaped supply chains worldwide. Yet lurking behind the success stories of dizzying growth numbers and hypermodern cities is a persistent challenge that analysts often refer to as overcapacity. The United States, in particular, has been very concerned about these problems. For instance, the Biden administration has stated that China's government has used unfair, non-market practices, to which the Biden administration claimed that these non-market policies and practices contribute to China's growing overcapacity and export surges that threaten to significantly harm American workers, businesses, and communities. That's the key word here, overcapacity, which is a big problem for both the United States and the rest of the world. That is what brought the Biden administration to raise tariffs on some Chinese goods. They, for instance, pushed tariff rates on solar cells against China's policy-driven overcapacity, which the Biden administration claimed has been depressing prices. So, with the world's current superpower decrying China's overcapacity, is it really a big problem not just for them, but for the rest of the world? Well, to understand that, let's first understand what overcapacity really means. To understand overcapacity, imagine a factory in China set up to manufacture 1,000 solar panels a day. If the demand for those solar panels, both domestic and international, totals only 700 per day, that factory is operating at an overcapacity of 300 solar panels. Overcapacity at a national level aggregates these gaps across multiple industries: steel, concrete, automobiles, machinery, real estate, and so forth. Over time, persistent overcapacity creates a range of economic, financial, and social distortions, from wasted capital to depressed prices and increased corporate debt. In China, this gap is often visible in large-scale infrastructure and industrial projects. Steel mills that produce more steel than what local and foreign markets can absorb. Coal mines whose production far outstrips energy demand, or property developers building entire districts of apartments where few people actually live. Overcapacity, consequently, is not merely a question of idle machines or vacant apartments. It is a systemic issue that ties into local government finances, employment, and Beijing's political priorities. So, how did China get here? Well, without having to go deep into history, you can already tell from the significant economic growth of China over the past few decades. The country saw spectacular rapid industrialization by opening certain sectors to foreign investors, which boosted economic growth rates, often exceeding 10% annually. This enabled China to eventually become the world's factory, churning out consumer goods at an unprecedented pace. But decades later, as the global economic environment shifted in the 2010s, China's breakneck growth began to moderate. The government itself recognized that perpetual 10% GDP growth was unsustainable, pivoting toward a new normal of slower, more balanced growth. Consumption services and higher value manufacturing were emphasized. At the same time, though, the heavy industries expanded during the boom years did not shrink fast enough. Thus, China faced the predicament of excessive production capacity, especially in historically core industries like steel, cement, and coal mining. But the history, of course, does not really tell the entire story. So, let's talk about the key drivers that actually drove China's overcapacity. There are three major reasons that drove China's overcapacity. The very first is no other than easy credit and the role of China's state-owned enterprises, SOEs. It has been well known for a long time that China's banking system has been dominated by state-owned or state-influenced institutions. These are banks that are directly owned by the government itself. These banks are then known to grant generous loans to state-owned enterprises, as they reflect government policy rather than strict commercial viability. SOEs, in turn, expanded their production capacity rapidly, sometimes ignoring actual market conditions. Here's a graph on the credit to government and state-owned enterprises to GDP. Here you can see just how big and fast credit has gone into the hands of these state-owned enterprises. As of the latest data available from the World Bank, it stands at 35.5%. While it may seem small, you must consider that in 2020, the GDP of China stood at $14.6 trillion, which means that 35.5% of China's GDP translates to approximately $5.2 trillion allocated as credit to government and state-owned enterprises, SOEs. That is not a small figure, especially if we compare it to, say, the United States. Here's a graph on the US credit to government and state-owned enterprises to GDP. You can see that the US has seen an increase in the past few years, but it is still below China's figure, as the US only has 19.5%. And what's concerning about this data that China has is the fact that it does not include other forms of support, like government guarantees, access to non-bank financing, or policy-directed lending for large infrastructure projects or strategic industries, where SOEs are often the primary contractors. These loans can then be problematic because if there was a mismatch between the revenue generated by these projects and the repayment schedules of the loans, it could lead to significant financial strain on the banking system and the broader economy. For instance, there is a report published by Stanford saying that China's banks allocate much more loans to state-owned enterprises, which they say allocated over 80% of loans in 2018, accounting for nearly half of China's debt for that year. Another major reason for China's overcapacity is the fact that they were the world's manufacturing hub. For years, China's industrial base relied heavily on exports. Products made in China were shipped to the US, Europe, and other major economies. As China's exports boomed, it continued building new factories and mills. Here's a graph on China's merchandise exports, data from the World Bank. You can see just how fast and substantial it has become in the past few decades. In 2022, it rose to a record high of over $3.5 trillion, a figure that is more than 10% of the world's total merchandise exports for that year. However, after the 2008 global financial crisis and subsequent economic shifts, global demand growth slowed. Trade frictions, particularly with the United States, further complicated the outlook. Despite these changes, many of China's manufacturing facilities remained operational, often at partial capacity, adding to overall overproduction. Thirdly, another big problem is China's massive urbanization push, where millions of people moved from rural areas to cities, led to a real estate construction bonanza. Here's a graph on China's share of the population living in urban areas from 1960 to 2022. Here, you can see just how fast it has grown. Back in 1980, only 20% of China's population lived in urban areas, but by 2022, the latest data available, it has grown to over 64%. The problem of this is the fact that many developers in China went on to build large apartment blocks and commercial complexes in anticipation of continued migration and housing demand. Local governments, eager for land sale revenues, opened vast tracts of land for new development. But then, as we saw in the past few years, problems came out. China's property market began to falter, exposing the fragility of this over-reliance on speculative development and easy credit. The cause and effects of this gave birth to what is known as ghost towns, where large areas with extensive new housing, commercial centres, and infrastructure, but few residents. This real estate overhang reflects another dimension of overcapacity: construction and related industries, steel, cement, aluminum, glass, etc., far exceed underlying demand. Just to show you the negative impacts of China's real estate sector, let's pull up a graph on China's house price index year-on-year changes. Here, you can see that China's newly built house prices have continued to post growth after growth. But in the past few months, starting in May 2022, newly built house prices started to contract. And as of the latest data available for November 2024, it has contracted by over 5.7%. This is a reflection of the broader issues plaguing China's real estate sector and the ripple effects on its economy. Now let's talk about the biggest part of this video: the problems. There are a lot of problems related to China's overcapacity, ranging from unnecessary debt to environmental problems, profit margins, and so on. But one of the biggest problems out there is no other than profit margins. Let's take the example of steel. China is known by far as the world's largest steel producer. Here's a graph on the top steel producers by 1,000 tons. Data from World Steel. Here, you can see that China produces more than half of the world's total steel production at more than 1 billion tons for 2023. But many people out there have voiced that this overproduction has depressed global steel prices, as China has been accused of dumping, selling steel at below market prices, leading to trade disputes and tariffs. Another problem that China's overcapacity brings is that it has crowded out emerging economies. Since China has a weak domestic demand and overcapacity leads to an export surplus, it has been claimed that it has limited opportunities for other emerging markets to grow their manufacturing sectors. Let's take a look at the net trade in goods, BOP, current US dollars, of China, data from the World Bank. Here, you can see just how much China's export surplus has grown over the years. For instance, in 2022, China's net trade in goods was a massive $665 billion, which is a figure larger than many major economies out there. The huge surplus is then a problem for many emerging economies because it creates an uneven playing field, where their industries struggle to compete with the sheer scale of China's export dominance. Emerging economies rely on manufacturing exports as a driver of growth, but China's overcapacity floods the global market with low-cost goods, making it difficult for these nations to establish a foothold. For example, here's a graph on the bilateral trade between China and ASEAN. Here you can see that from 2014 to 2023, China consistently had a trade surplus with the Southeast Asian region. This disproportionate trade advantage limits the ability of emerging markets to scale their own industries, leaving them dependent on importing intermediate goods from China. The last problem that we see here is no other than dependency on Chinese imports and monopolistic risks. Developing countries are becoming increasingly reliant on intermediate goods from China, which means that these nations are left with limited alternatives when sourcing critical inputs for their industries. This growing dependency exposes developing economies to monopolistic risks, such as price manipulation, restricted access to goods, and economic coercion by China. Some studies even say that in 2022, 20% of product categories in emerging markets were supplied primarily, which is over 50% by China, up from 15% in 2019. This dependency creates significant vulnerabilities. For instance, China's dominance in rare earths has allowed it to wield political leverage in the past. In 2010, China restricted rare earth exports to Japan over territorial disputes, showcasing how such monopolistic control can be used as a geopolitical tool. China's overcapacity is also not limited to problems seen globally. There are also problems domestically. Even though that is less talked about in today's video, the damages are still quite severe. The problem that many Western viewers see, however, is that China, its government, and even Xi Jinping himself does not see that China has an overcapacity problem. This can then lead to prolonged inefficiencies and exacerbate economic instability. The denial or downplaying of overcapacity risks means that industries may continue to operate under state protection and subsidies, further distorting market dynamics. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.